Thank you, John. I will be brief. I could be up here all day introducing Dr. Bierregaard. His accomplishments are many, and he will hopefully do a much better job than me explaining all of them. However, as Mr. Downs said, Dr. Bierregaard is a proud graduate of the class of 1969. While at Millbrook, he was a Big Zooey and Frank Trevor student. It was at Millbrook where Rob developed his lifelong interest in raptors and biological and ecological systems. Upon graduating from Millbrook, Dr. Bierregaard went to Yale to earn his bachelor's and PhD degrees, where he also met Dr. Tom Lovejoy, Millbrook class of 1959. Rob spent the next decade running and pushing forward the research conducted at Dr. Lovejoy's beloved Amazonian research project called the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments Project. Mr. Downs and my wife and young Atticus had the great privilege of attending that area, that research area called Camp 41. Truly phenomenal work that has been running now for almost 50 years. Since then, Dr. Bierregaard has continued his distinguished career teaching ornithology and ecology at UNC, leading research on barred owls and ospreys. Rob now calls the offices of the Raptor Research Foundation home as he took over the role of president in 2021. Many accomplishments, but if I may bend your ear for just a moment longer, Rob's true legacy is to carry on the critically important work started with Frank Trevor here at Millbrook, Tom Lovejoy at Yale, college and graduate school professors, and probably many of his students. As teachers, our legacies are lived out by our students. Max, wherever you are, Mac, Megan, Emma, Bridget, Hannah, Trevor, John, Stivey, and all of our alums and students here today. Pay close attention to Dr. Bierregaard as we all begin to think about our own legacies. Please join me in giving Dr. Bierregaard a warm Millbrook welcome.
Thank you, Dr. T. I go by Dr. B for all of my students, so they can't remember how to spell or pronounce Bierregaard, so here we are. Great to be back. I love this place. Loved it when I was here and love it now. So I'm going to be talking about Millbrook and connections and how we all can connect with each other and move forward in fostering our goal of environmental stewardship. So the funny thing is, I didn't want to come to Millbrook, which is an interesting, I bet you weren't expecting that as a lead-in to this talk. The other funny thing is that going to Millbrook was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was a pivot point in my life that got me to where I am today. And I can get away with saying this even if my wife were in the room. I could get away with saying this because if I hadn't gone to Millbrook, my path wouldn't have met to that carnival party in DC in 1988 when we met. So we're here today to give you all a feeling for some of the many paths your life can take should your interests lie in a career in the natural sciences or environmental stewardship. As the oldest on the panel, the path I took is pretty overgrown by now, but I hope by telling my story, I can offer you some general insights, if not specifics, that may help you down your own paths ahead. A lot of what I'll share comes from knowing and working with Tom Lovejoy for 50 years. Tom, who passed away on Christmas morning in 2021, was Millbrook's most distinguished, outspoken, and effective mover in the world of conservation research, and advocacy. Had he not left us in 2021, he would undoubtedly have been the keynote speaker at this event. He's here in spirit, and you're going to have to settle for me. So how did I get here? Growing up as with a Yale alumni dad and grandfather, there never seemed to be any question about where I was going to go to school. And the best way to get to Yale, it seemed at the time, was to go to St. Paul's in New Hampshire. And it was, this is of course an exaggeration, but it was sort of like you didn't have to bother to apply to Yale, you just packed your bags and went down to New Haven. So my overly confident parents had me just apply to St. Paul's for my freshman year, and I didn't get in. So what do we do now? So, well, Hotchkiss is a good way to get in, and then maybe we better have a backup school. So I applied to Hotchkiss at Millbrook, and I didn't get into Hotchkiss, and here I am. So I'm pretty sure that the reason I got into Yale was because of Millbrook. At my admissions interview, I think the interviewer asked me two questions. The first was, do you like Millbrook? And the second was, why? And 28 minutes later, when our half hour was up, he said, wait a minute, are you doing anything now? It was just before lunch. And I said, no. He said, hang on. And he went up and he got the Dean of Admissions, and he and the Dean of Admissions took me out to Louis' lunch, which Louis claims to, in New Haven, Louis claims to have invented the hamburger. So I was pretty naive then, but I had a pretty good chance, a pretty good idea after that lunch that my parents were right, I was going to Yale. Being one of the oldest member of the panel here, I want to give you sort of a feel for what Millbrook was like in 1969. And it was cold enough to have a ski hill on our own ski team. We had a rope tow. You can't see the rope tow here. This is a ski hill, and back in the in the late '60s, mid to late '60s, we had a ski team. We could ski 6 days a week, all winter long. We had a rope tow, a snowmaking machine. Quite a bit different from what we're experiencing now. Campus was a lot smaller, as was the student body. There were 160 of us boys. It was the Millbrook School for Boys then. And all of us were boarders. It wasn't exactly the dawn of the age of computers, but it was pretty early in the morning. Our math teacher, Mr. Gadd, somehow got us a computer that was the size of a small desk. So this wasn't a desktop computer, it was a desk. It was the whole desk. We programmed the computer using machine language on paper tape. There was a little holes were punched out of the paper tape, and we'd write our code. It would take 7 lines of code to multiply 7 times 8, and we'd feed that paper tape into the machine and watch our programs happen. So that was pretty cool. The community service program was, as it has always been, a big part of life at Millbrook, and for me, of course, it was the zoo. And there was Frank Trevor. I was always going to be a biologist, and somehow, somewhere, I loved animals of all sorts, loved to be out in the woods, and had my obligatory love affair with dinosaurs when I was 6 or 7. Unable to find any fossils in our yard in New Jersey, and not for want of trying, my interest moved on to more current species. When I got to Millbrook, I took Mr. Trevor's 2 biology courses, baby biology, or Benny biology as we called it then. Bennies were the third formers, and advanced biology, which was just an amazing biology course. At the zoo, I took care of Empress, the 16-year-old golden eagle. Each spring, I would go into Empress's cage with a whole armful of sticks, and I'd sit down in the corner of the cage with her, and I would hand her a stick, and she would take it and put it into a nest. And then she'd look at me, and I'd give her another stick, and she'd build it. So she would build a nest, and that was an experience. It gives me chills just thinking about it now. To build a nest with a golden eagle is something that very few prep school students have ever had the pleasure of doing. She would lay 2 eggs every year, and unfortunately they never hatched because I wasn't able to fulfill all of my responsibilities as her mate. My second year, Pete Jenny enrolled. Pete was already a young falconer and naturally joined the zoo squad, where he got me hooked on falconry and started the unofficial Millbrook School falconry team. There was a recent article published in the Journal of the North American Falconers Association about the group of 5 or 6 of us who, for a period of well, the 2 years I was here and then 3 or 4 years after that, falconry was actually a thing at Millbrook. Pete Jenny is an alum who certainly could have been on this panel. He went on to be the president of the Peregrine Fund, one of the most effective conservation organizations anywhere. There were 5 or 6 of us over the period of a few years who couldn't wait to get back to school after vacation so we could go out into the countryside around the campus and hunt rabbits, squirrels, and pheasants with our trained birds. We took over one of the zoo buildings to house our hawks, and for a few years, falconry was a real, albeit unofficial, thing at Millbrook. Those were the glory days of Millbrook, no matter what anyone tells. And I always remember when I was a zoo head and when it was my turn to check the zoo, all the animals, I'd go into the building where our hawks were, and they were all sitting on perches, on a long screen perch, and you look in, and they would all have their heads turned over their backs and tucked down into their feathers so it looked like a bunch of headless birds. And you'd open the door and flick on lights, and some of them would pick their heads up and look at me and then just see it was me and stick their head back into their feathers and go back to sleep. So stewardship of the environment wasn't yet a thing. It was budding, but it wasn't, it didn't have that name yet, and it wasn't one of the focal points of the Millbrook education as it is today. The conservation movement was growing, but it was mostly focused on the charismatic megafauna, the big, warm, cuddly things, elephants, rhinos, and giant pandas, and had yet to become a science. Across the nation, our air was foul and our waters dirty. Famously, or rather infamously, the Cuyahoga River flowing into Cleveland caught fire several times, an event immortalized in Randy Newman's great song, Burn On. So look that up and listen to it. It's pretty cool. Peregrine falcons had mysteriously disappeared from the skies east of the Mississippi and were faring poorly elsewhere. In case anyone, I'm often asked what my favorite bird is, and that's the answer. That's a peregrine falcon I trained and hunted with after my Millbrook years. Bald eagles and ospreys numbers were also crashing. The evidence was becoming incontrovertible that while the pesticide DDT was remarkably effective at ridding salt marshes of mosquitoes, it was also wiping out the high-level avian predators atop aquatic food chains. In the early 70s, DDT was banned. The Clean Air and Clean Water Acts and the Endangered Species Act were all passed by Richard Nixon, a Republican president who was by no means environmentally inclined, but who recognized what the people wanted at the time and did the politically astute thing of passing those landmark pieces of legislation. Those were the days. Hard to believe anything like that could happen in today's political climate. As I headed off to Yale, Mr. Trevor told me to look up one of his old students, Tom Lovejoy, who had graduated from Millbrook 10 years ahead of me in '59 and gone on to Yale, both undergraduate and for his graduate school. At the time, he was doing his PhD thesis research in the Amazon. When I arrived in New Haven for my freshman year, I hooked up with Tom, who had just returned from the rainforest. He arranged for my work-study job to be his research assistant. I helped manage the data he was collecting down in Brazil. While he was in the rainforest banding birds, I was in the computer lab at Yale, entering his data onto IBM punch cards, moved up from paper tapes to punch cards. We're getting there, but magnetic floppy disks were still a long way in the future. After graduating from Yale, the next logical step for me was to go to graduate school. So I got into the graduate program at Penn and moved to Philadelphia, where coincidentally Tom was. So we spent a few more years together in Philadelphia, and by the time I finished my degree, Tom had been hired at World Wildlife Fund in DC. He was the first scientist hired by the organization and really one of the first scientists to work for any of the conservation organizations. This was the beginning of the long-needed marriage of conservation and science. There is an organization now, the Society for Conservation Biology, which is a very large group, influential journal published, that hadn't even been formed. This was 10 years before the Society for Conservation Biology had even been formed. At the time, most ecologists wanted to find some remote corner of the world where humans hadn't affected the local ecosystem so they could unravel its intricacies in pristine natural systems. Conservation was left to the tree huggers. However, it was becoming increasingly obvious that there were very few places where our species wasn't affecting local ecological processes, and that pristine environments were rapidly being replaced by ecologically impoverished habitats dominated by our species. So, while lots of people wanted to go up to the cloud forests of Ecuador, it was harder and harder to find places you could go to find those undisturbed bits of habitat. So more and more scientists, with Tom Lovejoy front and center amongst them, were waking up and smelling not the roses but the forests burning. It was time to act and act with the best science we could apply to the problems of habitat and species preservation. Habitat fragmentation is the inevitable outcome of our species encroaching on natural ecosystems. You can see here a bit of Amazonian rainforest that's being dominated by human populations. In the mid-70s, there were lots of papers being published about the design of natural preserves, but very little data on which to make the decisions. One of the questions was whether it was better to have a single large, SL, or several small reserves. So the SLOS debate was raging in the scientific literature, but no one had any idea of how to really answer the question. So Tom came up with the brilliantly simple idea of going to Brazil, and a very ambitious idea, to set up an experiment to test this, to collect the data we need to answer this question. So he hired me to go down and be the director of the Lovejoy project, or as Alan said, the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments project. So I learned just enough Portuguese to get by, and in 1979 I moved to Manaus, where the Rio Negro and the Amazon come together, deep in the heart of the world's largest rainforest. So Tom knew that by law, Brazilian ranchers developing the rainforest had to leave 50% of the forest standing, so they could only cut half of their property. So Tom said, well, let's take that 50% that they're not going to fell, clear cut, and rearrange those into a series of fragments of different sizes. So my job was to go down into pristine forests, like on the left, with some trail cutters and map out areas of 1 hectare, 10 hectares, 100 hectares, 1,000 hectares, study them with my bird team and the plant and mammal and herb and all the insect groups that we could census those patches of forest before they were going to become fragments, and then after they were isolated by the ranchers' deforestation, we could track what species survived and what species disappeared in those different patches. So I was down in Brazil as the field director of the project for about 8 years, and I came back to the Smithsonian and worked there for a while. Then I went on, as Dr. T said, to UNC Charlotte and studied barred owls there, and I did some really cool work with ospreys, putting radio transmitters. You can see that on the back of this osprey, there's a small 1-ounce device that has a solar panel on it, so it keeps getting recharged, and it sends a signal 540 miles up to satellites that are in circumpolar orbit. You let them go and then get to track them and see where their migrations are. Those are the tracks of all the juvenile ospreys I tag, mostly on Martha's Vineyard. And the really cool thing there is so many of them go out over the Atlantic, but they only do that once. When they come back on their first trip north, they go over land and they discover that by going to Cuba to Florida and up the coast, you can get back to Martha's Vineyard without having gone over the 1,200 miles of the Atlantic, because they find their parents and say, why didn't you tell us? And then they never do that again. The next trip down, they go back the way they discovered on the way north. So there's an adage that you've all heard, it's not what you know, but who you know that matters. Well, that's close, but it's not really quite right. It's what you know and who you know that matters. And so one of our jobs here is to sort of get you all thinking about connections. And so Tom was really the master of this. He was the master networker before we even started using the word. This is a primitive piece of technology called the Rolodex, which is now your contact list on whatever device you're using. And Tom's Rolodex or contact list was famous. If you weren't in there, you weren't anybody in the world of conservation. Tom had me go through his Christmas card mailing list one time, and there was a slow time in preparations for the project, and I went through and cleared out a lot of people that were duplicates or I knew had died, and discovered that the Dalai Lama was in Tom's Christmas card list. So there is someone who's connected. So Tom's great genius was bringing important people together from all different walks of life to solve conservation problems. Every year at New Year's, he would take a wildly eclectic but influential group of politicians, journalists, and artists down to our research camp in Manaus to let them see and feel and hear the rainforest ecosystem. So Yogi Berra, a famous catcher for the New York Yankees and master of the astutely incongruous and amusingly philosophical insight into life in general, one of his quotes is, "No one goes there anymore, it's too crowded." Supposedly advised that when you come to a fork in the road, you should take it. So, so those forks in the road will come at you much more often than if you're networked than if you're not. Some of you will will follow your muses into careers in business, the arts, medicine, education, who knows what all else. Well, a surprising percentage of you will go on to work in biology, conservation, or sustainable development. Wherever your life takes you, thanks to your time here at Millbrook, you'll be aware, some more deeply than others, of the responsibility that you have to be the stewards of our planet. And thanks to your time at Millbrook, you'll be better prepared than most of your peers to have a meaningful impact on how our society evolves in response to the environmental changes that we have inadvertently set in motion. Tom was asked how he could be optimistic in the face of all he could see around him. His response was something to the effect of, "There's no other option." So this is a chance for a lot of you to begin networking when you sit in the sessions, at the end of your sessions, during the rest of the day. Reach out to the leader of your group and make that initial contact. Keep that contact going if that's a field that you think you might like to pursue. Spread your network wide, keep it active, and keep it going. And as you head off, you're going to be all the more successful becoming a mover and a shaker in this important task of saving our planet from ourselves. Thank you.